I used to think infidelity was something that happened to other people. The kind of women who ignored red flags or married men who looked too good in mirrors. I was smart, self-aware, emotionally literate, or at least I pretended to be. I could dissect relationships like they were novels, finding metaphors in every fight, subtext in every kiss. I thought that meant I was safe from it, safe from becoming the kind of person who says, I didn't see it coming. But I didn't see it coming. Not even a little. We met at a time in my life when I was proud of how together I was. I was 31, living in a downtown apartment that smelled like fresh paint and ambition. My job wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. I was one of those women who brought salads to work and could afford skincare that didn't sting. When I met Michael, he felt like a reward for years of trying to be a grown-up. He was steady, charming in that understated way, the kind of man who could fix a sink and listen to your Spotify playlist without making fun of it. He was, simply put, safe. And for someone like me, someone who had spent most of her 20s in relationships that felt like running on glass, safe felt revolutionary. It started small, the way all good mistakes do. He'd stay late at the office, and I'd joke that he was having an affair with spreadsheets. He'd laugh, kiss me on the forehead, and tell me I was ridiculous. I believed him because he was calm, predictable, a creature of routine. He had never given me a reason not to, and maybe that's why it took so long for me to see that trust can become its own kind of blindness. The first real moment of doubt came on a Thursday night. He came home later than usual, his shirt slightly rumpled, his cologne too fresh, like it had been reapplied. I remember the sound of the door closing. It felt heavier than usual, like it carried the weight of a secret. I asked if everything was okay, and he said, "Just a long day." That should have been enough, but something in me stirred. Maybe it was the way he avoided my eyes, or the fact that he didn't ask about my day like he always did. Instead, he poured himself a drink, scrolled through his phone, and smiled faintly at something I wasn't part of. That smile became my obsession. You can tell yourself not to look for answers, but curiosity is hunger disguised as reason. I told myself I trusted him, but trust, I've learned, can coexist with suspicion the way love coexists with resentment. They feed each other quietly until they take over. The proof came 2 weeks later. A text, not even a dramatic one, just a fragment of a conversation that didn't belong to me. "Last night was too good. I can't stop thinking about it." My heart didn't break. It folded inward like paper catching fire at the edges. I remember reading it over and over, hoping I'd find context that would save me, that would make it something else. But there was no other way to read those words. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just sat down, hands clasped, and said, "I didn't mean for it to happen." That sentence, I think, is the anthem of every coward. I remember staring at him, thinking how strange it was that the man I loved, the man whose laugh was once the safest sound I knew, had just become a stranger sitting on my couch. I wanted to scream, to cry, to make it cinematic, but instead I went quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peace, but shock pretending to be it. The weeks after were a blur of half-packed boxes, forced apologies, and that awful word closure. I moved out first. He didn't stop me. I think we both knew that once the truth is spoken aloud, you can't go back to pretending. Still, I missed him. God, I missed him like missing was a form of addiction. I missed the smell of his coffee, the sound of his footsteps, the weight of his arm over me in the mornings. Love doesn't end with betrayal. It lingers, stubborn and stupid. It took me months to understand that I wasn't grieving the relationship. I was grieving the version of myself that existed inside it. The woman who believed in him, in us, in the idea that love could be both safe and passionate. But safety, I learned, can hide rot beneath its surface. Love can coexist with lies for years before you notice the smell. I tried to move on. I went on dates with men who were kind and careful, who told me about their favorite movies and their dogs. But every time someone reached across the table to touch my hand, I flinched. I didn't trust my own instincts anymore. I didn't trust kindness. It felt like a setup, like the first move in a game I didn't want to play again. Months turned into a year and life went on the way it always does. I got promoted. I moved into a new apartment. I bought new sheets, the kind that feel too crisp at first. I laughed at work, drank wine with friends, learned to cook again. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd wake up and reach for a person who wasn't there. It wasn't him I missed anymore, it was the illusion, the comfort of not knowing. And then one night I saw him again, at a bar of all places. He looked older, tired in that way people do when they've run out of lies. He saw me too. There was a moment, brief, fragile, where it felt like time folded in on itself, and we were both back in our kitchen making pasta and laughing about nothing. Then reality returned. He smiled, that same faint, careful smile, and I realized I felt nothing. Not anger, not longing, just a quiet sort of gratitude that I had survived him. We didn't speak that night. I left before he could say anything, before the universe could tempt me into rewriting what had already been finished. I walked home in the cold, hands in my pockets, and for the first time in a long time I felt free. Not happy exactly, but unburdened. There's a difference. I don't believe in clean endings. I think healing is a slow kind of chaos, a dance between remembering and forgetting. But if I've learned anything, it's this. Sometimes the love that destroys you is the same love that teaches you how to rebuild. And maybe that's enough. After that night at the bar, the world didn't suddenly tilt back into alignment. There was no epiphany, no cinematic swell of music when I realized I was finally over it. Healing isn't like that. It's a collection of small, unremarkable moments that add up slowly, like sunlight inching across the floor until one day you notice it's warm again. For weeks after seeing Michael, I kept expecting to fall apart. I thought maybe the sight of him would unravel me again, but it didn't. If anything, it made everything feel quieter. It's strange, the way closure sometimes sneaks up on you, not in the moment of confrontation, but in the stillness that follows. I started walking home from work instead of taking the train. 40 minutes through the city, headphones in, watching strangers argue, laugh, kiss on crosswalks. Life goes on everywhere, in every direction. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in a window and barely recognize myself. I looked softer somehow, but stronger, too. There's a kind of strength that comes from being broken open and surviving it. One evening, it started to rain. Not a polite drizzle, but the kind of downpour that turns streets into rivers. I ducked under an awning beside a bookstore I'd never noticed before. The smell of wet concrete and ink mingled in the air, and I felt something shift. Not joy exactly, more like the faint memory of it. Inside, the store was warm, a little messy, filled with crooked shelves and handwritten notes taped to the covers of books. I don't know what made me do it, but I started talking to the guy behind the counter. His name was Julian. He wore glasses that kept slipping down his nose and had ink smudged on his fingers. We talked about nothing, the rain, the smell of old paper, how people buy self-help books when they really just need a friend. He wasn't charming in the polished way Michael had been. He was awkward, careful with his words, but when he smiled, it felt honest. I stayed for almost an hour, pretending to browse. When I finally left, he handed me a book I hadn't picked up. There was a note inside. Sometimes the story changes when you're ready to read it differently. It wasn't romantic at first. I went back a few times, mostly because it felt safe. He'd recommend books, I'd pretend to care more than I did, and we'd talk about small things that didn't matter but somehow did. He asked about my life once, and I told him the truth, or most of it. I said I'd been in love once, that it ended badly, that I was still figuring out what that meant. He didn't ask for details. He just nodded, like he understood that some stories don't need to be told all at once. Weeks turned into months. We started getting coffee after his shifts, sitting by the window and watching the city move around us. He never made me feel like I had to perform my healing. With him, silence wasn't something to fill, it was something to share. But healing isn't linear. There were days when I'd wake up and still feel that old ache, the ghost of what was. There were nights I'd dream of Michael, his voice, his touch, and wake up angry at my subconscious for still giving him space. One morning, I found myself scrolling through his old messages, not because I missed him, but because I wanted to understand who I had been back then, the girl who had believed in forever. I didn't recognize her anymore, and that hurt in its own way. Julian never asked about him, but one night I told him anyway. We were sitting on his fire escape, watching the city lights flicker like tired stars. I told him about the affair, the text, the way my world had folded in on itself. I told him how I'd rebuilt piece by piece, how some days it still felt fragile. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "You deserve better." He just reached out, his hand resting lightly over mine, and said, "You're allowed to let it go." And maybe that was the moment I started to. Love after betrayal feels like walking on a bridge that's still being built. Every step is uncertain, every plank a test. But Julian never asked me to trust him. He just showed up. Steady, patient, present. That kind of love isn't loud. It's not the fireworks you see in movies. It's a candle in a dark room that keeps burning even when you forget to notice it. I moved into his apartment a year later. It wasn't perfect. We argued about dishes, about work, about the stupid things couples argue about when they're both scared of repeating old mistakes. But the difference was in how we fought. With Michael, fights had been walls. With Julian, they were bridges. Sometimes, when I couldn't sleep, I'd lie there and watch him breathe, thinking about all the versions of me that had existed before. The woman who trusted too easily. The one who stopped trusting at all. The one who thought she'd never love again. They were all still inside me, stitched together by the quiet persistence of survival. A few years later, I got an email from Michael, just a short one. He said he was married now, that he'd seen something that reminded him of me, that he hoped I was happy. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I read it once, smiled, and deleted it. The kind of closure you give yourself is always the cleanest kind. Sometimes I think about how much of our lives are defined by the people who break us and the ones who help us heal. I used to believe love was about permanence, about choosing someone and never wavering. Now I think it's about presence, about showing up even when you're scared, about forgiving yourself for the things you didn't know. Julian once told me that people aren't chapters, they're annotations. They change the way you read the story, but they don't write the ending. And maybe that's true. Maybe there isn't an ending, just a quieter beginning somewhere down the line, when you've finally learned that loving again isn't betrayal. It's proof that you survived. I still walk past that bookstore sometimes. It's where I first remembered what hope feels like. The door chime still sounds the same, soft and familiar. Every once in a while, I see someone standing under the awning in the rain, looking lost, and I think about how easily everything can change with a small act of kindness. The night air smells like wet pavement and ink. The world feels wide again, uncertain but full. And for the first time in years, I don't need to look back. Because the story isn't about who broke me. It's about who I became after. Months went by after that night of realization, and something in me began to settle into a peace I didn't recognize at first. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was steady, like breathing without noticing it. The world no longer revolved around what I'd lost or who had hurt me. It started to turn toward what I could build. Julian and I found our rhythm, though it wasn't the fairy tale kind. There were quiet mornings with coffee cups balanced on piles of unopened mail, his half-asleep murmurs as I left for work, the faint hum of the city through the windows. Love wasn't dramatic anymore. It was ordinary, but that ordinariness felt like grace. I used to think love had to be consuming to be real, that the ache, the jealousy, the fear were all signs of its depth, but maybe it's the opposite. Maybe real love is the one that doesn't ask you to disappear inside it. Still, some ghosts never leave completely. There were nights I'd wake up from a dream I couldn't remember, heart racing, a shadow of panic clinging to my chest. Julian would turn in his sleep, reach for me instinctively, and I'd stay very still, afraid he'd feel how tense I was. It wasn't him I was afraid of, it was the memory of what it felt like to trust someone who didn't deserve it. I'd lie there watching the moonlight move across the ceiling and whisper to myself that this was different, that I was different now. Sometimes I believed it. One morning, while sorting through old boxes I hadn't opened since I moved, I found a photograph of Michael and me. We were standing in front of a mural downtown, arms around each other, his face half lit by sunlight. I stared at it for a long time, not with longing but with curiosity, like looking at an artifact from a past life. There was a version of me in that picture who thought she knew what love was, who believed that safety meant sameness, who mistook silence for comfort. I wanted to tell her that heartbreak wasn't the end of her story, that it would, somehow, be the beginning of her becoming. I put the photo in the trash, not out of anger, but because it didn't belong to me anymore. That night I told Julian about it, about finding the photo, about what it made me feel or didn't feel. He listened quietly, the way he always did, and said, "You don't have to erase your past to move forward." I smiled, realizing that's exactly what I'd been trying to do all along, erase instead of integrate. Pretend that the pain had no place in who I was now. But it did. It always would. Healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means carrying it differently. A few weeks later, we went to dinner with some of his friends. The restaurant was loud, laughter bouncing off the walls, everyone talking over each other. I caught myself watching the couples at the table, how they leaned into each other when they spoke, the subtle ways their hands found each other under the table, the small, almost invisible tendernesses that make up a relationship. I realized how much I'd once feared those moments, how easily they could turn brittle if trust cracked. But as Julian reached over and brushed his thumb against my wrist, I didn't flinch. It's strange, the way love teaches you to soften again after you've been shattered. It's not about pretending the break never happened. It's about learning how to live with the cracks showing. They become part of you, a quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself. Months turned into years. We built a life that wasn't perfect, but it was real. There were fights, over work stress, over small misunderstandings. But there was also laughter, shared meals, the comfort of someone knowing exactly how you like your coffee. Life became less about avoiding pain and more about embracing the mess of being human. Every once in a while, something would remind me of Michael. A song, a place, an offhand comment, and I'd feel a flicker of something. Not sadness, not even nostalgia, just acknowledgement. Like nodding at a shadow that used to follow you but no longer has weight. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't forgive him either. He was simply part of the story. The middle, not the ending. One evening, years later, Julian and I sat on our balcony, the city lights flickering like distant fireflies. We were quiet, the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. He turned to me and asked, almost casually, "Do you ever think about the life you would have had if things had gone differently?" I thought about it, the parallel version of me still stuck in that apartment, still trying to make something broken look whole. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I think about the life I have now." He smiled, kissed the top of my head, and said, "Good." In that moment, I realized healing isn't about finding a love that replaces the one that hurt you. It's about finding a life that doesn't depend on anyone else to make it meaningful. It's about realizing that even after everything, after betrayal, after heartbreak, after nights spent wondering if you'll ever feel normal again, you still can. Sometimes I still write about it, the way people on the internet write confessions into the void, hoping someone will understand. I don't write for closure anymore. I write because the story feels like proof that you can survive the worst kind of love and still believe in it afterward. Because pain doesn't mean you were wrong to try, it means you were brave enough to feel. And if someone out there reads it, maybe they'll know what I know now, that losing the wrong person is just another way of finding yourself. Because the truth is, healing doesn't look like moving on. It looks like standing still long enough to see that the person you've become is worth staying with. The last time I saw Michael was on a Sunday morning. It wasn't planned. I was walking through the farmer's market with Julian, our hands full of peaches and flowers, when I heard someone say my name behind me in that voice I hadn't heard in years but could still recognize instantly. It froze me, not because I wanted him back or missed him, but because for a split second, I was transported back to the woman I used to be. He looked almost the same, older, maybe a little softer around the edges, but still with that half-smile that once made my stomach twist. He said my name again, quieter this time, and I turned. Julian glanced at me, sensing something, and I managed a small nod. It was surreal, standing there with the man I loved beside me and the man I once thought I'd love forever in front of me. "Hey," Michael said, just that, like we were old friends who hadn't spoken in a while. "Hey," I replied. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me more than anything. He asked how I'd been. I said I was good. Really good, actually. I told him about my job, how I was working on a project I cared about, how life had somehow become both simpler and fuller. He smiled politely, the way strangers do when they don't know what to say. He didn't ask about Julian. Maybe he didn't want to know. There was an awkward pause, the kind that sits heavy between two people who share too much history and too little future. Then he said, "You look happy." I looked at him, really looked at him. The man who once made me question everything about myself. The one whose love had felt like drowning in slow motion. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger or sadness or regret, just distance. Like he was a chapter in a book I'd finished long ago, the kind you don't reread because you already know how it ends. I said simply. I really am. He nodded like that was enough. Then he said something I'll never forget. I'm glad you found peace. I don't think I ever did. For a moment, I wanted to tell him he would someday, that people change, that time can soften even the deepest ache. But the truth was, it wasn't my job anymore to comfort him. I just smiled and said, "Take care of yourself, Michael." And then I walked away. When we got back to the car, Julian squeezed my hand. He didn't ask what that had been about. He didn't need to. The silence between us was understanding, not curiosity. Later, at home, I sat on the couch and thought about all the versions of myself that had existed over the years. The naive girl who fell for promises, the heartbroken woman who thought her life had ended. The one who rebuilt herself piece by piece, without realizing she was becoming someone stronger. And I realized something. Love isn't about finding someone who never hurts you. It's about becoming the kind of person who can survive it when they do. For a long time, I used to think infidelity was the worst kind of betrayal. And maybe it is. But there's another kind, the betrayal of self. The one where you abandon your own needs, your own voice, just to keep something that was already falling apart. That's the one I spent years forgiving myself for. Julian and I married quietly the following year. No grand gestures, no fairy tale expectations, just a small ceremony with the people who had seen me through the worst and celebrated the best. I wore a simple dress, carried a bouquet of white roses, and as I walked toward him, I didn't think about Michael once. Not even a little. That, to me, was the real miracle. Our life together wasn't perfect, but it was honest. We argued sometimes, and we made up. We learned how to apologize without ego, how to love without possession. There were nights when the past crept back into my dreams, but it didn't haunt me anymore. It just reminded me how far I'd come. Sometimes, when I scroll through Reddit late at night, I see posts from women who sound like I once did, confused, broken, apologizing for wanting more. I never comment, but I read every word, and I silently send them strength. Because if I've learned anything, it's that heartbreak doesn't destroy you, it reveals you. The woman I am now still believes in love, but she also believes in boundaries, in peace, in walking away when something stops feeling right. She believes in mornings where she wakes up next to someone who doesn't make her question her worth. She believes in herself. It took losing everything I thought I needed to understand that I was never missing anything at all. I just hadn't met the version of me who could stand alone. And if I could go back and tell my younger self one thing, standing in that empty apartment the night everything fell apart, it would be this. You're not ruined. You're reborn. This pain isn't your ending. It's your becoming. Because that's what love and loss do. They strip you down, force you to face yourself, and then, if you're lucky, they give you the chance to start again. So when people ask how I survived it, how I went from betrayal to peace, I tell them the truth. I didn't just move on. I moved forward. And that made all the difference.